Hello again, everyone. Dave Benson here, Senior Advisor for Threat Mitigation and Global Security Operations for the Center for Personal Protection and Safety. I'm going to continue with our series this month on what is threat assessment and threat management. And I want to spend a little bit of time in our session today to briefly talk about what that might entail as a practical matter if you decide to either join the Threat Management Advisory Team retainer, which provides real-time threat assessment and management on a 24-hour basis, or just become a CPPS client tied into our threat assessment, threat management services. The 5 things that I tend to do for clients, I'm going to go over them very quickly, and then I'll add a little more meat on the bones, if you will, is the behavioral threat assessment part. And that is that process that helps determine if information that you come upon could actually turn itself or be a viable threat. You know, there's a difference between making a threat and posing a threat. The more capability, the more planning behavior, the understanding of a definite target, all these things tend to make potential threats more viable. The second one would be coming up with effective intervention options. And there's a lot of different ways of saying this, but I like intervention strategies or options. So what happens if your threat management team or your organization comes upon some threat-related information that you're very concerned about? You want to have it vetted, and you've determined that it's a viable threat. Well, the next logical step is, what are you going to do about it? And so intervention strategies and different options, I work with clients on a regular basis to help them develop them and then the implementation of those strategies. Now, an intervention strategy can be something as similar as suspending somebody for a day or a week. It can be a termination process. It can be something even more subtle but important as an EAP intervention, some medical treatment, whatever that might be. But each multidisciplinary threat assessment, threat management group, it's incumbent upon them to understand what resources they have available, both internal and external, and how they might come into play as you manage potential threats. To remind, I would be the example of the subject matter expert, the threat assessment professional that comes in and works with your organization to sort out some of these strategies. And then the other would be investigative recommendations. How are you going to move forward? Threat assessment related investigations are not necessarily interrogations, nor should they be conducted that way. There's different situations and different types of interview techniques that you want to employ, because the goal is to get as much accurate information as possible as a potential threat to help us determine the viability. And then an actual consultation. I have very many clients that are very robust, frankly. Some have been trained by me from the ground up for their programs. Others have not, but have been I'm retained by them on behalf of the center to determine they might have come up with a preliminary threat assessment. They might have come up with some observations and some intervention strategies, and they just want to bounce those ideas off of me. And so these are really the 5 main ways that I interact with clients. So let's go a little bit of a deeper dive. And as we know from our earlier discussions, behavioral threat assessment is a process. You want to be able to determine viability. You want to be able to determine if that person is not just making a threat, but is capable of not only carrying out the threat, but also, conducting harm. They've done specific training, maybe in advance for this, planning behavior, all these sorts of things. And intervention options then become absolutely critical, because contrary to popular belief, in the world of threat assessment, it's not a one and done strategy. I always tell my clients, if your goal in threat assessment and threat management is to gather enough evidence to get a police prosecution, you might as well get the Tums and the Maalox out now, because you're going to be very disappointed and very frustrated. Because oftentimes in the world of behavioral threat assessment, these individuals that are having difficulty dealing with life's challenges don't always cross the criminal line. And even if they do, they may or may not be of interest to law enforcement for a variety of reasons. So in reality, some of these cases never really go away. And so the intervention strategy becomes even more important. What are we going to do initially to mitigate the possibility of harm? It's seldom a permanent mitigation, but it allows us to continue our threat assessment process. And then what are some of the other strategies that we might need to employ, not only now, but in the near term and the long term? Because many of these cases will rear their heads again. Likewise, interview strategies, there are different categories of people to be interviewed. Confidentiality is extremely important, particularly in threat assessment and threat management, because to be very candid with you, not everything that comes across your table is going to turn into a viable threat. So we need to maintain the integrity of the information, the people that are reporting the information, and the people that we are interviewing in the course of gathering this data to put together an accurate behavioral threat assessment. Only then can we begin to put together some intervention strategies. And then finally, recommendations on how to move forward. For example, it's not unusual for particularly less mature threat assessment or threat management groups to want to go straight to the source of the potential threat. And that is, there's all kinds of problems with that. First and foremost, you want to try to gather safely, of course, as much information as you can so you can be smart enough to move forward. That means, generally speaking, interviewing the potential person of interest or the alleged perpetrator is not the first thing that you want to do. If you can safely do so, you want to be able to gather as much information as possible. That's the essence of threat assessment. And then also, how do you interview third parties, witnesses, victims, and then ultimately the person of interest itself? They're all a little bit different. They're all somewhat nuanced, and it's part of that training triage that robust threat assessment and threat management teams really need to be aware of so they can effectively pick and choose their strategies. And then finally, one of the things I'm constantly reminding my clients is that a threat assessment is a point in time. It's not good forever. In some cases, it might not be good over a few hours or a few days. The threat assessment is only as good as the information you are provided. And so when I do specific behavioral threat assessment for my clients on their behalf, I make it very clear, this is my assessment based upon the information and the circumstances that we have now. And so anything that changes down the road, they need to let me know, because that could very well modify the assessment. And as I said, finally, some organizations are comfortable enough putting together their own threat assessments, and oftentimes they'll bring me in. Some clients have me meet with their virtually, usually, their threat assessment, threat management team every time they convene. I'm happy to do that. That's a little unusual, but we have some clients that have frankly, some pretty dicey threat scenarios that they routinely deal with because of the course of the business and their clientele and the demographics. And then oftentimes I'll just get a phone call and say, Dave, I have this issue. I want to run it by you. This is what we're thinking about doing from an intervention strategy, anything you'd like to offer. So it really does run the gambit. When we say it's a full service threat assessment, threat management consultancy, it is. The final thing I want to say is that we are only as useful as the time that you use us. It doesn't make sense to pay good money to retain me on behalf of the center to be your threat assessment professional and then seldom, if ever, use me. So take full advantage of all your resources depending on the circumstances, and certainly the interaction I have with my clients, both personally and corporately, is certainly one of the highlights of what I do as a threat assessment professional.